Welcome to the Legendarium. Our second episode will focus upon the gruesome origins of the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel. To recap, Hansel and Gretel tells the story of a poor woodcutter, his two children Hansel and Gretel, and the wicked stepmother. The wicked stepmother convinces the father to leave Hansel and Gretel in the woods, as there is not enough food to feed the whole family through the winter. The good-hearted but weak-willed father reluctantly agrees to leave his two children in the forest. After a couple of attempts to leave them, the children try to leave a trail of breadcrumbs to find their way home, but ultimately find nothing except fat birds and no path home. In time, they find a witch who lives in a house made out of gingerbread, bread and cake in the original medieval version. The witch invites them over to dinner, quite literally. She locks Hansel into a cage to fatten him up for her oven, while Gretel is forced to become her slave. At first, the children are able to delay the murder of Hansel by using a chicken bone to convince the witch that Hansel is not gaining any weight. However, the witch eventually loses patience and decides to cook Hansel anyway. While the witch asks Gretel to light up the oven, Gretel insists that she does not know how to do so. Frustrated, the witch shows her how to light up an oven, and then Gretel shoves her into the fires. They take the witch's treasure and then go home. They find that their wicked stepmother has disappeared, and the father is overjoyed to have them back. With the treasure, they truly enjoy a happily ever after. Some scholars believe that the story may have originated in the Baltic region of Eastern Europe, which was home to ethnic Germans during the High Middle Ages. The Baltic countries feature a number of stories of clever children outwitting monsters such as ogres in the style of Hansel and Gretel. However, most scholars believe that the story had its origins in the Black Forest region of Germany, which is on the east bank of the Rhine River. Many fairy tales have changed greatly from the Middle Ages to modern times. Hansel and Gretel is no difference. Hansel and Gretel has not undergone a complete reinvention the way that Snow White and Cinderella have. However, there are enough differences to give the story a very different taste. Please pardon my pun. For one thing, Hansel and Gretel are not abandoned by their wicked stepmother. Their biological mother and biological father both conspire to have them abandoned in the woods. Second, instead of using a chicken bone or some similar instrument to convince the witch that Hansel is not gaining weight, they find dozens of skeletons in the witch's basement, and Gretel steals the arm and finger bones of one of the witch's many victims, gives it to Hansel, and that is how they convince the witch that Hansel is not gaining weight. The final major change from medieval to modern is that both the mother and the father are waiting for Hansel and Gretel when they get home. The modern version implies that the stepmother was in fact the witch, since the stepmother appears to have vanished as soon as the witch was killed. So, how did the story change from the medieval era to modern times? The answer lies with the two men who first wrote it down. To our knowledge, the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm. Jacob and Wilhelm were both born in the late 1700s. They lived in a Germany that was divided into over 200 separate states, and thus was easy pickings for the French Emperor Napoleon during the early 1800s. As you can see from this map, much of Western and Central Germany was ruled by the French Empire at the time through a puppet state called the Confederation of the Rhine. Jacob and Wilhelm wanted to fight against Napoleon, but decided to do so with words instead of bullets. They devoted themselves to collecting German fairy tales. Though popular legend tells of them going to isolated peasant homes in search of the fairy tales, most of them came from their own middle class and even aristocratic acquaintances who had heard them from either nursemaids or their own parents. As they wrote down over 200 fairy tales, Jacob and Wilhelm hoped to, first of all, take the folk wisdom of ordinary people and give it to the upper and middle class. They hoped that this would show Germans what it meant to be German and give them a better reason to fight against the French, because Germany should be ruled by Germans, not the French. In addition to hoping that their efforts would inspire Germany to overthrow the Napoleonic yoke, Jacob and Wilhelm hoped to lay the foundation for a common culture in Germany, which, as I mentioned before, was divided into 200 separate states. When they first published their fairy tales in 1812, they published something very close to the medieval version of Hansel and Gretel. The reason they did so is because they were writing for adults at the time, and they wanted to show Germans their true cultural heritage and inspire them to fight. However, by the 1850s, Germany had been at peace for over 2 generations, and during that time, Germany had gone from a poor backwater made up mainly of farms and tiny towns to a rising urban industrial power, much like Charles Dickens' United Kingdom. And this rising urban industrial power also had a new middle class who wanted good, wholesome books that would teach their children proper morals. And that is the reason why the Brothers Grimm removed all of the content that middle-class parents wouldn't have liked their children to see and gave us the modern version we are familiar with today. One thing you might notice about Hansel and Gretel is that whether it is the medieval version or the modern version, the characters seem to be obsessed with food. Hansel and Gretel are brought to grief by eating the witch's gingerbread house. Hansel and Gretel's parents in both versions abandon them in the woods because they want enough to eat, and even the witch intends to cannibalize Hansel and Gretel. So why are all of the characters in the story so motivated by food? The answer is that Hansel and Gretel was likely first told during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. For the 3 centuries before 1315, Europe enjoyed a warm climate known as the medieval warm period. Long summers and short, mild winters ensured that farmers could grow rich crops. The population of Europe in some areas doubled, and the area became much more prosperous than it had been during the Dark Ages. However, as the earth entered a cooling period, the crops began to decline and people began to go hungry. By 1315, the situation reached a crisis point and famine broke out. The worst of the famine lasted from 1315 to 1317, but the food supply would not be enough to feed Europeans until 1322. The consequences of the Great Famine were truly horrific. There were reports of parents abandoning their children in the woods so that they would have enough food to eat. This, of course, is shown in Hansel and Gretel. However, the terror doesn't stop there. There were reports of grandparents and other aged relations simply being turned out of the house because they couldn't work and their children didn't want to feed them anymore, leaving them to starve. There are also reports of people being reduced to eating bird feces, mildewed wheat, animal fodder, and finally each other. According to tabloids of the time, peasants would tear hanged criminals down from the gibbets and eat their flesh. There are also reports of people digging up the graves of the recently dead and eating them. Because of this Great Famine, an entire generation grew up very sickly and underfed. Because of this, the Black Death, which hit only 25 years later, proved to be even more devastating than it otherwise would have been. In addition to the famine, Hansel and Gretel tells us something else about medieval Europe. People were afraid of the woods. Now, when I first say that, I imagine most will think about wild animals, wolves, bears, boars, and other unpleasant things with lots of teeth. And that is certainly a problem. However, a more dangerous issue, especially for children at the time, was that the forests were so dense that if you went more than a half-mile from the village, you might never find your way back. And even before the famine, there were reports of children leaving the village to go play in the woods. They would go just a little bit too far, and they would never be seen again. This likely helped to inspire the story of Hansel and Gretel along with the famine. However, Europeans at the time had another reason to fear the woods, beyond it being very easy to get lost in them. Medieval Europeans believed that forests were places of black magic, with even animals playing the role of magicians. For example, Europeans believed that the bear actually gave birth to lifeless lumps of flesh, and that they didn't become bear cubs until the mother bears used their magical tongues and enchanted spit to bring these lifeless lumps of meat to life, also causing them to grow fur and teeth. They also believed that bears could practice a primitive form of herbalism to heal minor wounds. Europeans also believed that the wolf was a black magician. They believed the wolf to be the devil's hound and thought that it could fly over the treetops in order to more easily raid sheep from the sheepfolds. They called the wolf the devil's hound and also believed that it drank human blood. However, they likely feared the boar most of all. Boars were known for being very ferocious and violent, and Europeans believed that was because boars were possessed by the spirits of the ancient pagan kings who had forced the Hebrews into the cruel Babylonian exile. Obviously, Europeans are not going to get an A on the biology test. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed my presentation on Hansel and Gretel, and I look forward to seeing you again. Don't forget to like and subscribe.